Shall I go ahead and introduce myself?
Yes, please do.
Okay, yeah, let me get started. My name is Doug Plata. I'm a physician trained in family and preventive medicine, currently doing urgent care, occupational medicine. And I am the president and the founder of the Space Development Network. This is a free to join space advocacy organization that is projects oriented. And as people join, they can go ahead and fill out what their interests are. And then we group people together into working groups to try at our level to go ahead and move things forward, especially with demonstration projects. So just to let everybody here know, and glad to see we have a large group. This was very much a last minute offer. That the spot, I guess somebody didn't show up, and so it was blank, and I noticed it was blank. And so I contacted James Burke and I said, hey, you know, I can do the same presentation I did in 2018. And that is meeting the medical needs of a growing base. So he said, go ahead. And so if any of you were here 3 years ago and were in my presentation, you're just going to get a refresher on that. But I think the large majority of you, especially in this virtual format with people all around the world, you probably have not heard this at all. So I think it will be fresh and new for you. So let me go ahead and start screen sharing here. Okay, so providing for the medical needs of a growing base, meaning how do you provide for the medical needs of a base as it goes from the initial habitat all the way through to full scale settlement, even private settlement. Okay, and I cannot seem to advance this. Oh, I guess that will work. Okay, so you know, as they taught me in my speech class, give a you know, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to describe what I believe are going to be sort of the 4 crew phases, and that's going to be important context for this presentation because there's going to be different medical needs in each of the different phases. I'm going to discuss a little bit about the prevention and screening. In other words, before people go, what can be done to make sure that they don't bring medical conditions with them that cannot yet be met at the base. And then emergency rescue briefly. And then what sort of medical facilities would be needed at each of the 4 crew phases? And then how about medical and other providers? How can we make sure that we have the right staffing and the right specialties for the needs as we anticipate that we'll need them? And then I'll mention something briefly about medications. So first of all, let's set the context, and that is the phases. So I am proposing that there will be, when I talk about the initial team, I'm really talking about the initial permanent crew. So like on the moon, we'll have Artemis, as we all understand. But for Mars, my sense is that it is going to be Starship, and it is going to be, my guess is the first people, they're probably not going to want to risk a lot of lives on the very first time. And so my guess is probably no more than 25 people in the initial permanent crew. And then after it's proven that people can be on Mars safely, then I think they will really begin to ramp up with this fleet of starships. And I personally think that the sooner that NASA gets on board, recognizing that it is going to be Starship going to Mars first, I think the better in terms of a public-private partnership. So the initial permanent team would have different medical needs, sort of limited medical needs compared with the other one. The next phase is the international Mars exploration. And the way I figure it, and this would include Americans first probably, but considering the everyday low prices that SpaceX offers for per seat, I think that there is going to be an interesting and a strong demand on the part of the nations of this world to send their national astronaut heroes to the surface of the moon, basically by purchasing a ticket from SpaceX. And so this will be an important, it'll be limited in time, but it will be a very important intermediate phase that will bridge from the initial permanent crew into private settlement. And speaking of which, I break down the initial private settlers into two phases, or the private settlers into two phases. There's the initial private settlers, and then there's the later private settlers. So the initial private settlers are going to be people who are really selected for their skills and for their fitness, and none of them will have known heart disease, for example. But the later private settlers, they are going to be bringing a lot of medical issues with them, and they will tend to be older. So let's go through these phases. But first, let me talk about what can be done from a prevention and screening standpoint. So these two phases, the initial permanent crew and the international crew, I imagine they're going to be a lot like the Apollo astronauts, and that is they are going to be highly fit. They're going to be checked head to toe for every possible medical condition, and they're going to be cleared as being unlikely to pose a medical risk in terms of just bringing something with them. Now, if they develop something while on Mars, bone mineral density starts going down, or various things, then yes, that will need to be dealt with, and that's not something that you can necessarily completely prevent. And so they will need medical care, but more for those things rather than because they have some active cancer or heart disease, or et cetera. So that's both for these really fit individuals. And so the medical care for them, I imagine, is going to be a lot of checking to make sure, are there biomedical indicators indicating that they need to be returned home in the next Mars-Earth launch window. And of course, there'll be a whole bunch of medical sort of experimentation done on these individuals. And that's part of the medical responsibilities. But mostly it's going to be being prepared to deal with emergency situations, whether that's an accident or whether maybe it's a pulmonary condition that develops. That will be the focus during these phases. Now, for the initial private settlers, again, these are people who are paying their own way, and yet there's going to be a significant selection process, I believe, during this phase. And that is the number of healthcare providers and the variety of healthcare providers may not be the full spectrum by the time the initial private settlers arrive on Mars. And so they too need to be screened and need to be made sure that they're not likely bringing a medical condition that's going to place a burden on the healthcare system, the very limited healthcare system on Mars. So again, these people are going to be screened beforehand. They are going to be tested quite thoroughly. And if it's found that they do have a medical condition that might develop on Mars and place a burden on the healthcare system there, then they would probably be held back until the later settlers when there is more healthcare system established on Mars. And then finally, the later private settlers, this is getting to the point where, if you have the money and you're healthy enough to launch and endure the trip there, then you're good. You're good to go. And so these people will tend to be older and will tend to be bringing quite a few medical conditions with them. Now, why do I say they're probably going to be older? And if you notice the pictures that I've chosen here, these tend to be older folk. And the reason why I say that is because there's like 3 criteria for going to Mars. And that is, you need to be able to have saved up enough money to be able to buy the ticket, not just the ticket to go, but also to buy the habitat space and to buy life support for the rest of your life, these sorts of things. Usually for most people, not everyone, but for most people, it takes decades, 2 or 3 decades to go ahead and build up that sort of wealth. Well, as 2 or 3 decades pass, you become 2 or 3 decades older. And so older, millionaires tend to be older sort of people for obvious reasons. That's one reason. A second reason they're probably going to be older is because if you've got dependent children, you can't just leave them. And if they're in school and they have a lot of friends and they need parental care, even if you have the money to go, you're probably going to be disinclined to move the family. Okay, you want to wait until all of your kids fly the coop and you're sort of freed up. And the third thing is occupational responsibilities. And so this is where most jobs, at least as it is right now, are in-person jobs, although COVID seems to have changed that a bit. But nonetheless, people tend to work until they retire. And then when they retire, they feel free. They've got the money to do stuff. They've got the free time. They're not trying to, build up a career. And so for those three reasons, I think the population for the private settlers is going to skew towards the older. And along with that will come a significant quantity and a significant burden of medical conditions brought to Mars. So as they're being launched, they are going to be screened to make sure that they're safe to go. But if they do have, their diabetes is well controlled, their hypertension is well controlled, well, that's good enough. They can go. Okay. So emergency rescue, I think, is going to be part of the medical system. And in my thought is that they're considering the size of Mars and initially the limited facilities. You're going to have at the international base, you'll have the highest level of healthcare, but you may have people exploring or tourists going somewhere. You may need to have a starship ready to, refueled at all times and a sort of an EMS crew ready to launch and land and be able to intervene quickly in the field. And boy, that would be one exciting job. Now, emergency return, huge difference, obviously, between the moon and Mars. The moon, if a condition is developing 3 days, you can get them back to the highest levels of facilities, which is on Earth. But on Mars, you've got, depending on the window, but you've got a minimum of about 6 months to be able to get back to Earth. For most medical conditions, that is just too much time. And so I think that Mars is going to need to have to be able to provide a fairly high level of care at the destination at Mars. Okay, so what about the medical facilities? During the initial permanent crew, I think that the medical facilities are a part of the habitat that's sort of designated, has some medical supplies and medical equipment there. But, during, the rest of the time that it's not being used for that, well, it's being used for something else. And so there's not going to be a whole lot of medical facilities with the initial permanent crew. And so it's just the basic things that are needed, especially for emergency care. Now, as the international astronauts arrive on Mars, you do have the need to expand the base to be able to house all these people and to be able to feed them and all the life support systems. So we're getting into these specialty hubs and it's significantly growing. So some of those specialty hubs would be medical, health, medical facilities, medical, dental, you name it. And so I imagine that, but for them, it's going to have an emphasis on the emergency care. So something sort of like this, where you have really all the equipment necessary to deal with the variety of medical situations. You will probably have some places for hospital beds, sort of step-down units or whatnot, general wards. But that's probably not going to be used a whole lot, presumably. And so these can be sort of dual-purpose facilities. Now, the initial private settlers, they tend to be old, and old people tend to develop problems more quickly than younger people. And so, yeah, in fact, you may need to really start to be getting to have a hospital-like system, having clinics for them to go and visit the different specialists. And then later private settlers are basically everything. I think this is just a normal population. And you see in the lower right hand, will there actually be facilities for giving birth on Mars? Well, that would be great, but only after we know it's safe. After the animal studies have been done and we figure out what the artificial gravity prescription is, we wouldn't want to do that until it's safe to do that. But basically, yeah, the whole 9 yards, some of everything in terms of the medical system. Nursing homes. Now, when I talk about retirees, a lot of people just almost reflexively use the term retirement home. And that's not what I mean. I'm talking older people who are healthy. They are sort of your active senior community, people on bicycles and healthy. You are not going to see something like this. You're not going to see people in their walkers. They waited too long. They should have gone on that trip earlier. So that's not what we're talking about. However, when older people go to Mars in 10 or 15 years, they could, just a natural course of health, they could debilitate to the point where they actually do need a nursing home. And I could imagine something like this. Now, before they reach that point, might they prefer to be back on Earth to be with family before they die? Well, maybe, but then there is a significant launch experience and reentry experience that the very elderly may not be well suited for. So I'm imagining there will be nursing homes on Mars eventually. Okay, perhaps the core of my presentation is this, and that is the medical providers. With the initial permanent crew, you see in the upper right-hand corner, I envision a physician and would be cross-trained with somebody else in the crew. And these people would be sort of all-purpose. They've had a little dental training. They've had, certainly probably ER physician would be ideal, but with other training specifically for the needs of this crew, especially as they're on Mars and far from being able to return to Earth. We need to have a lot of capability within 1 or 2 people. Or I suppose if the group is 25, then maybe 2 or 3, 4 people, something like that. Now for the international astronauts, I imagine, I'm hoping that there would be coordination between the countries, because I think if countries are sending their national astronaut heroes to the moon and to Mars, I'm going to guess that most of those people are probably going to remain behind to be representatives of the country in this new branch of humanity, this new settlement that is beginning to grow, this international base. And for that reason, I think there needs to be coordination in which saying, okay, what do we need at different points in time? So as the population growth of the base gets to certain points, we need certain specialists and certain healthcare workers. And so those countries that have people that can, astronauts that can serve that need, perhaps they'll be pushed to the front of the line, and they'll be able to do some of the earlier exploratory missions. And so I imagine I'm imagining that this phase is going to get into at least the hundreds, and with Starship probably in the thousands of seats that international countries would purchase. And so with that amount, I think that you could really get the full spectrum of healthcare workers there during this phase, and that's going to set things up very well with in preparation for private settlement. For the initial private settlers, my feeling about this is that they should really, again, there's a similar selection process where you're able, if you have some skill that the international base doesn't have, you're pushed to the front of the line, provided that you're very healthy. So there's a very strategic way of making sure you're ahead of the curve in terms of having the healthcare providers before you are probably going to need them. And that's the key thing. I think this is very solvable. It just needs planning to be able to make sure that the people going first are the people that you need most. And that's not just in medical, it's, in life support systems and agriculture and all these sorts of things. I imagine initial private settlers, in order to be part of that historic initial people moving off Earth and opening up a new planet to humanity, for the privilege of doing that, they will pay and they will gladly volunteer their services to their fellow settlers. I think that will sort of be an expectation or even a requirement for the initial private settlers. And so, yes, I'm imagining that you would have a whole cadre of healthcare workers from that population themselves. Now, Mars presents a bit of a problem when it comes to telemedicine because of the speed of light time lag. And so I think that there will be some telemedicine, but not anything quite like what could be done on the moon in terms of telemedicine. And so I think that that's going to be present, but sort of limited. Okay, and then the later private settlers, well, frankly, by the time you have them, you're going to need the full spectrum of healthcare workers, that those people who will tend to be older and all of their healthcare needs. Okay, surgeries, absolutely. I think that, you know, imagine if you fall over a cliff and break your leg. Yes, you'll need surgery. And there's many types of surgeries, and so I think surgery will be an early requirement, possibly even some surgical experience, even at the initial permanent crew. People with that experience. Dentistry, highly important. I'm hopeful that everyone that gets on a ship will have dental X-rays, and they'll make sure that they are, you know, not developing an abscess, periapical abscess, or apical abscess before they get on the starship. And then there will need to be a dentist. And I would hope that there would be a good preventive dentistry where people are routinely being screened and preventing these problems. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize about that. My computer just froze. I couldn't even turn it off, so.
Oh, okay. Just FYI, we have just a couple minutes left, so.
Yes, I see that.
Sorry about that, everybody.
So yeah, so dentistry, we're going to need the full thing. Psychiatry, I imagine there will be psychiatrists, and psychology, and medicines to go along. Medicines are low mass, can do it. Telemedicine for psychiatry, I don't know about that. That may be pushing it. Obviously, all of the allied health fields, especially as private settlers come. And yeah, mostly emergency medicines in the early phases, but in later phases, the whole variety of medications. I'll pass on that. And so